Welcome to the Compliance Officer's Playbook Podcast. Today we're diving into a report that's really causing a stir in the UK financial industry. And honestly, it should have compliance officers everywhere kind of worried. It's the House of Lords report on the FCA's proposed naming and shaming policy. And the title itself is pretty aggressive. Naming and shaming, how not to regulate.
Yeah, it doesn't hold back. And you're right, this isn't just a UK thing. The FCA is often seen as a global leader in financial regulation, so what they do can have a ripple effect.
Right. Okay, so for anyone who hasn't been following this whole story, the FCA, that's the UK's main financial regulator, they basically want to start publicly naming firms that are under investigation way earlier in the process. They say it's all about transparency and protecting consumers, but the House of Lords report is raising some serious red flags.
Yeah, and the biggest one, the one that the report really focuses on, is that the FCA hasn't done any sort of cost-benefit analysis for this huge policy change. They're basically saying, hey, we might damage these firms' reputations, we might even hurt the UK's competitiveness, but they haven't even shown that they've considered the downsides.
Hold on. So they want to make this massive change, a change that could have serious consequences for businesses, and they haven't even bothered to do a cost-benefit analysis. That seems a little reckless, to be honest.
Well, the report actually uses the word reckless. It's pretty harsh in its assessment of the FCA's approach here.
Okay, but I'm assuming the FCA has some reason for wanting to do this right. What's their argument?
Their main argument is that the current rules for announcing investigations are just too restrictive. Right now, they only announce in exceptional circumstances, and the FCA says that things like investment fraud, which is sadly pretty common, don't meet that bar. They want to move to a public interest test, which gives them a lot more flexibility to name names early on.
Okay, I can see their point about wanting to be more proactive, especially when it comes to things like fraud. But wouldn't that also create a situation where firms are basically being publicly accused before they even get a chance to defend themselves?
That's exactly the concern. And it's not just a hypothetical problem. The report actually gives a real-world example of how this could go wrong. The British Steel Pension Scheme case.
Oh, right. That was a huge scandal. Remind me what happened there.
Well, basically, thousands of steelworkers were given really bad advice to transfer out of their defined benefit pension scheme. The FCA did eventually take action, but a lot of people felt that they were way too slow to react, and that if the public had known earlier, it could have prevented some of the damage.
So the FCA is basically saying, look, if we had this naming and shaming policy in place, we could have stepped in sooner in cases like British Steel and protected more people.
Exactly. But the report pushes back on that, saying that the FCA already had the power to act more quickly if they thought it was necessary. And even more importantly, the report points out that the public interest test is really vague. Who decides what's in the public interest? How do you apply that consistently? It opens the door for a lot of subjectivity and potential unfairness.
Yeah, I could see how that would be a nightmare for firms. Imagine you're a fintech startup, you're trying to secure funding, and then suddenly the FCA announces that they're investigating you, even though you haven't done anything wrong. That could completely destroy your business.
Absolutely. And that's why the report is so critical of the FCA not doing a cost-benefit analysis. They haven't even tried to measure how much damage this policy could do, not just to individual firms, but to the whole UK financial sector.
Okay, so the FCA wants to be more transparent, but the way they're going about it seems super risky. And on top of that, they haven't even done their homework to show that the benefits outweigh the risks.
Right. And there's another layer to this that we need to talk about, which is how this new approach could affect the FCA's other big goal, promoting the UK's competitiveness. They're walking a tightrope here.
Okay, let's unpack that in the next part, because I have a feeling this is where things get really interesting.
So yeah, as we were saying, the FCA is also supposed to make the UK a good place to do business, attract investment, all that. But this whole naming and shaming idea could actually hurt them there.
Yeah, I get that. If firms start thinking they could be publicly embarrassed by the regulator, even if they're innocent, they might just take their business somewhere else.
Exactly. And that's not just a theory. The report actually mentions a few times where firms have specifically said that the FCA being so aggressive was one reason they moved their operations out of the UK.
Ouch. So it's like the FCA is trying to clean up the UK's financial sector, but they might just end up pushing the mess somewhere else.
That's a good way to put it. And the ironic thing is the FCA seems to know this is a problem. In their revised proposals, they added some things to their decision process that are supposed to consider how it affects firms and the market as a whole.
Okay, so at least they're trying to be a little more careful about the fallout. What kind of things are we talking about?
Stuff like the size and type of the firm, how it could affect financial stability and the overall economic climate. They've also given firms more time to prepare before an announcement.
Well, I guess that's something. But it still seems pretty vague, right? How do you even measure something like the impact on financial stability? Seems like there's a lot of wiggle room there.
You're right, and that's one of the big criticisms in the report. They haven't really given any clear instructions on how they'll actually balance all these factors. It still feels like a judgment call, which means firms can't really predict what will happen.
And being able to predict what's going to happen is pretty important when you're talking about something as serious as a public investigation by a regulator.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not just bad PR. That's the kind of thing that could scare away investors.
Exactly. And that's why this whole public interest test is so tricky. It basically makes the FCA the judge, jury, and executioner. They decide what's in the public interest. They decide who gets named, and they decide when to do it.
So even with these changes, the main problem is still there. The FCA hasn't really shown that this naming and shaming is actually needed, or that it won't do more harm than good.
Right. And that brings us back to the elephant in the room, the missing cost-benefit analysis. The report really emphasizes that the FCA hasn't shown that the potential good of this policy outweighs the very real risks.
You know, it's interesting. We've been talking about this from the perspective of firms in the market, but what about consumers? Don't they deserve to know if a firm is being investigated? Isn't that part of what the FCA is supposed to do, protect consumers?
That's a great question. And it's a tough one. There's no question that transparency is important, and that consumers have a right to know if there might be problems with the phone they're using.
But at the same time, you don't want to make every little investigation a public spectacle. That
Mhm.
could make people lose faith in the whole system.
Exactly. And that's why this whole debate is so complicated. It's not just about transparency versus secrecy. It's about finding that sweet spot where consumers are informed, but businesses aren't unfairly hurt and there's no unnecessary panic.
Right. It's about making sure that justice is not only served, but that people can see it's being served. And that's where this public interest test gets really slippery. Who gets to decide what's in the public interest? And what are they basing that on?
Well, and that's a big part of what the House of Lords report is asking for more clarity, more transparency from the FCA on how they'll actually put this policy into practice. They're basically saying, look, if you're going to do this, you got to be super clear about the rules and you got to make sure those rules are fair.
That seems like a reasonable ask.
Yes.
It's like the FCA is trying to change the rules of the game while the game is already going on, and that's never going to go over well.
Exactly. And that's why this report is so important. It's a huge warning sign to the FCA that they need to be careful and that they need to be much more open about their reasoning and their process.
Okay, so let's pretend for a minute that the FCA does go ahead with this new approach. What does that mean for compliance officers in the real world? What should they be doing to get ready?
Well, I think for starters, this whole thing is a real wake-up call for compliance officers. They need to really look at their internal controls and make sure everything is airtight.
Yeah, absolutely. If the FCA is going to be quicker to name names, firms need to be ready for that spotlight, even if they haven't actually done anything wrong.
So it's not just about following the rules. It's about being able to prove you're following the rules.
Right. You have to be able to show the FCA, the public, everyone watching, that you have strong compliance procedures and that you're serious about compliance. And that's where good documentation comes in, right? If you can't show your work, it's going to be hard to convince anyone that you're doing things the right way.
Exactly. Having clear policies, good training programs, and keeping thorough records, that's all going to be essential in this new world.
It's almost like compliance officers need to think like lawyers now, always thinking about the worst-case scenario and building a case to defend their firms.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just about what's going on inside the company. The report also talks about having a solid crisis communications plan.
Oh, right. Because if you do end up being named in an investigation, you need to be ready to respond quickly and effectively.
Exactly. You need to be able to control the story, get your message out, and make sure your stakeholders know that you've got things under control.
It's like that old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Invest in good compliance and communications now, and you might save yourself a lot of trouble later.
Couldn't agree more. And I think this whole discussion highlights something really important for compliance officers. It's not enough to just check the boxes and follow the rules. You need to be thinking strategically about the bigger picture, about how regulations are changing, and about how your firm can succeed in that environment.
So basically, compliance officers need to be more proactive, more forward-thinking, more involved in the big decisions their firms are making.
Exactly. It's not just about following the rules anymore. It's about managing risk-giving strategic advice and being a key part of shaping your firm's future.
This has been a really interesting deep dive. It's definitely made me think about the challenges that compliance officers are facing these days.
Yeah, for sure. It's a complex world out there, but with the right knowledge and the right approach, compliance officers can not only survive but actually thrive and really add value to their
Yeah.
firms.
Well said. Well, on that note, we want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the FCA's proposed naming and shaming policy. We hope you found it helpful and that you'll join us again for more episodes. And if you love this show and want to hear more episodes like this, packed with expert analysis and insights on the most important topics in compliance, consider becoming a paid subscriber today for $4.9991 and get full access to all premium episodes packed with insights, stories, and value you won't find anywhere else. The link is in the show notes. Thanks for listening.